And yeah, let's get started with today. It's a debrief of the COP27 that took part the past 2 weeks. And yeah, as you might have followed it more or less closely, we'll have two participants of the COP itself, and well, we'll have Philipp to give us a more general overview, and yeah, the results or reports afterwards have been mixed, so we'll dig into some more details of the conference now in the coming hour. So we'll have with us, yeah, first of all, Philipp Pattberg. He's director of the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute, but also professor of environmental policy at the Institute for Environmental Studies at the VU. And yeah, I don't know, you have a longer title, but it's enough for now. And we also have Eszter Szedlacsek, also difficult, PhD student at IBM, and Xiaoran, also PhD student at IBM. Eszter focuses more on climate and poverty in sub-Saharan Africa, and Xiaoran is working on the China's new role in governing global climate change. So yeah, they'll both give us an insight into their research. And yeah, with that, Philipp, I think you can give us a bit of an overview of the conference.
Thanks, Nele. Great. So really nice to see so many of you. Some I recognize from my work, others maybe from lecturing you, and others I don't, which is nice because it means there are new people here interested in the results of COP27. So I just printed them out. It's 8 pages. You just read them and then you know what they decided on. But obviously, it's not that easy. Unfortunately, it's much more difficult because, and I will just not talk about it too long, just give a brief introduction. It depends really on your yardstick. And they're basically, like in all good debates, 2 camps. There are those that say it was a total disaster, doesn't work, we only have a couple of years. And what are they doing there? 45,000 people went to the scuba diving resort in Egypt, where you shouldn't go in the first place because all sorts of other problems. And we're doing what? Where they were producing a couple of pages of text. But did that reduce any emissions? Well, chances are it actually had a lot of emissions because people took the plane, right? There are others that say, well, that's a bit too quick, because what do you actually expect from an international negotiation? Their job is to make legal text, and they're really good at that, right? Because they did that for the 27th time, and each time they actually solve a couple of small problems, and they might not look big to you, but they are. So maybe we have the total wrong expectation of what these COPs do. They're not there to solve problems. They just reflect the consensus of 196 member states. So if you want to complain, go to The Hague and talk to Mark Rutte, because he's the person that doesn't implement what they should implement. And you could do the same with any other government if they don't put you in jail when you ask the question, which also is a big problem. So given all of that, this is a tremendously successful process because it's actually building a global normative consensus. Now, when you ask me where I am on that, I'm also a good scientist. I'm somewhere in the middle. It's not surprising, probably, because both of those positions have some truth to them. So let me briefly go through that argument. So it's true that given the time frame we still have, which is approximately a couple of years until we really have to reduce emissions drastically, this seems to be an awful slow process. But to start right away, when I look into this document, they do actually acknowledge that. So they talk about that emissions reductions of around 40% need to be achieved by 2030. And this is exactly what the IPCC says, though they're not really saying anything different. They say, yeah, that's what we need to do. So that's pretty good. It's still not reflecting the urgency that you might expect. But on the other hand, there are some really important milestones, and we will discuss them with our panelists. So first thing I want to mention is, although they didn't really say we should abandon coal and gas and oil, they tried. Maybe you picked that up. India, very smart, said maybe we should discuss down-phasing, out-phasing of gas and oil. And if you now think India is an environmental progressive country, yes, but they did that predominantly because last time in Glasgow, someone put coal there, and they still want to use coal. So their idea was, when we talk about other stuff, right, then it will not look as bad for us. But that's a great thing, because now we discuss all fossil fuels across the board. And although countries did not agree to put it in this declaration, the discussion is there. And if you just compare that to 10 years ago, no one was discussing that. Actually, the problem is fossil fuels and fossil fuel companies. By the way, the biggest lobby group in Sharm el-Sheikh was fossil fuel. Now, if you say, that's really, really bad, you're right. But it also is a clear sign that that's actually something they want to lobby about. Because if they would get their way, they wouldn't even bother to go there, right? So it's actually a sign that they get increasingly contested. And that's why they need to go there and try to convince people that they're also doing quite well. Actually, you can see that here in this country where Shell has this great advertisement campaign right now. It doesn't even give a website, it just says search for Shell somewhere. And you're like, okay, can do that. But it's showing you that they are concerned, because otherwise they wouldn't spend money on that, okay? So fossil fuels are in the discussion, which is a little win. You might still say, Philip, what are you trying to tell here? It's not sufficient. But that's how those processes go. We need to build a global consensus that actually fossil fuels need to be phased out and large parts need to stay in the ground. Now, I tell you something. We are now even discussing in legal circles and practitioner circles and policy circles a global non-proliferation treaty for fossil fuels, something like the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. And that's a radical idea, but it has been discussed in Sharm el-Sheikh. It hasn't been agreed upon, but it has been discussed. So I'm getting increasingly more excited about this, because what I try to tell you is you can't expect them to just decide everything. They need a couple of years to negotiate it. Another thing that I want to point to is that for the first time, and we will talk about that at length, they managed to work on a workable consensus between the rich countries and the poor ones. Because in a nutshell, the climate problem is that the rich countries caused the problem, and now we ask the poor countries to fix it with us. And that's not fair, right? So the poor countries go like, yeah, but you need to help us. And we go like, yeah, but we don't really want to pay for it. But now, for the first time, we discuss loss and damage, which is a technical term for if you can show that something is already happening, you might get money. We don't call that compensation, because that's a legal term and everyone is super afraid, but it is actually compensation. Now, this is a major development. Good, so I'm getting increasingly excited about all of this here. I'm moving to that side. Anyway, showing that I'm increasingly positive about the summit. And I could go on a couple other things in here. For example, they talk about finance, and they say we need 4 trillion every year. So that's a lot of money. But they also say, maybe you should start to discuss that with the big lenders, the World Bank, IMF. They should actually make sure that the money does not go to fossil fuels. And that's a major change. More excited. Yeah, see, I'm getting excited. Now, however, I'm moving back here. Of course, there was also stuff that wasn't really very pretty. So some civil society activists couldn't go there. There was a lot of discussions if you can actually freely speak at the summit. And that some people didn't go because they were afraid that if they were to speak out, there would be repercussions. It's a bit like the World Cup. You might know that Germany is playing Japan right now. I didn't check, but I'm super excited now. Okay. not really so excited, but it's the same problem. How do you deal with this political situations? Now, another thing was indeed that there seemed to be an elephant in the room. That was the war in the Ukraine, right? Maybe you forgot that already. That's a major problem out there. And of course, it's a real one if Russia is in the same room as all the rest, and you can't really discuss that. But actually, everyone is discussing it because it's all about energy, transitions, and the really intricate problems we have. Now, the European Union, which is usually always there to say, we're the best, we're going ahead, we're doing all this cool stuff, had a big PR problem this year. And it was, they just went a tour around the globe to buy in all sorts of fossil fuels to make sure you can heat up your apartment. And then they have to go to Sharm el-Sheikh and say, we also want to reduce that. And all the other countries called them on that, said, this is really hypocritical. This is really, doesn't make any sense. So the EU was weakened a bit, which also takes away one major player. So all in all, I would say, it's a typical lukewarm conference. It's not one big success, but it's definitely not a failure. Why? Because it is actually the job of those conferences to make little progress every year and to build consensus. If you don't think that's activistic enough, I agree. We shouldn't be activistic in COPs. We should do that in other platforms, because that's where the pressure needs to be on the domestic systems and on domestic decision-making, one, and also on the big polluters. And that's all up to us to decide how we do that. Now, so I'm sort of a bit in the middle, but I wouldn't say it is a big failure. I'm really excited to hear what my colleagues say, so both online and here, Xiaoran, to what they have observed, because often the devil is in the detail. One last thing that I heard from my colleagues who sent a lot of Twitter stuff while they were there They said it was really crowded. It felt like someone said it felt like on an airport in Schiphol when you wait for the baggage. That's how it felt for 2 weeks. So maybe it wasn't really comfortable. But it also was a COP in Africa. It was a COP that put the spotlight on a region that is usually not really in anyone's focus. And to some sources I heard, that gave a lot of participants quite some, support. So also some pride to say, look, we can do that. Lots of problems, but we can do it. And it's important that we do it in Africa. Just to reiterate that, a continent that will be majorly affected by climate change, has contributed almost nothing to the problem, but needs to be part of the solution. And that is something to remember. It is a really difficult political situation. So if I see all of those things, I would say, it's not, could have been worse. Good. But my colleagues might prove me wrong. So I want to, give the floor now to Eszter, is that right? And here, Eszter, when you have observed, and if I understood correctly, you observed most of it remotely. So maybe you can also reflect a bit on how that experience was. I step aside. If you're interested, I leave that here. This is actually the declaration. So it's not just a piece of paper I made up, it's the real one. Okay, just if you want. Good.
Okay, should I start? Can everyone hear me? Yes. I hope. I don't see you, so. Okay, hi everyone, my name is Eszter and currently I'm in Paris. As some of you may know me, I'm at IBM, a PhD candidate, but I'm also part of a research project named Adapted. And in the frameworks of that program, I am based in Paris right now, conducting research on the climate poverty nexus. And here I focus on more the economic aspects of the interactions between climate and poverty. And otherwise, I also focus on the governance and political aspect of the same topic. And my geographical focus is Sub-Saharan Africa. And my case studies will probably be South Africa and Kenya, but this does not restrict my focus in overall. So I attended COP entirely online, and there were reasons for that, which I'm going to share in a minute. And basically, the main goal of my research and my participation was to kind of prepare a ground for future work on discourse analysis. And I'm probably going to analyze quite some years of COPs and COP statements and speeches and probably debates as well about how certain aspects of climate and poverty together, mainly in relation to Africa, became institutionalized at COPs or did not become, or if they became part of the mainstream arguments or they remained on the sidelines. So this was basically the topic that I was most interested in for this COP as well. And originally, I really wanted to attend in person, but there were some personal issues as well. But also the main reason was that it was super expensive. And I've heard that a lot of people complained about this as well. So also young activists, other researchers were really thinking of going or not. And also I have heard that there were several issues with African participants actually to get access to Egypt, and their registration was not confirmed while the summit or the conference was in Africa actually. So this is quite controversial. But as you can imagine, if it was so expensive that a researcher from a global north country cannot afford it, then it was so expensive that someone from the global south would definitely not have access to it. But anyway, so that was the main reason that I didn't go, and I luckily could participate online, which was super nice. And I think this is the second time that this is feasible. So I've heard from others that they also participated online for the last year's conference. And this year was also possible, which I really was enthusiastic about. And I have to say it worked quite well. So I was really skeptical about how much I will be able to participate. And of course, I had a lot of other things to do as well. So there were definitely disadvantages to the online participation too, because if you're there for 2 weeks or even just 1 week, then you focus on nothing else but the negotiations. And this way, I maintained basically classes, and so I did not take a week off to focus on COP. But I tried to, of course, do as much as possible. And what was really funny actually is that sometimes I would go to a French class or something like that in the evening, and from 6:30 until 9. And when I got back, they were still continuing almost the same conversation on the topics that I followed. And that was actually quite funny. What else? Yes, and maybe a bit more about personal things, just regarding the participation, is that it's quite funny how the roles of the delegates change in a minute, actually. So I don't know if this is a general experience or not. It's probably because they're also human, you know, which you sometimes tend to forget. But it was quite funny that after the meeting ended and the microphone and the camera was still on, you could hear some kind of funny comments, like one of the delegates expected the meeting to end earlier, and she was like, what do I do with all this energy right now? And it was like midnight or something. So obviously they made jokes about it. But okay, so I guess that is about the informal part. And in my participation, I mainly focused on the loss and damage, and because that's highly relevant for obviously for African countries and sub-Saharan African countries, because they are probably the most vulnerable across the world, also with other countries who are least developed, and also small island nation states. And I also focused on the impact of the response measures, which was probably not a hot topic, you could say. So I don't think that many researchers focused on that, but I was quite interested because I think that we rarely reflect on the actual impact of the policies that we make and the differentiated impacts across countries and also across group constituencies. So basically, I was interested in how the contrast between developing countries and also in the developing country groups and between developed countries go. So let's start with the loss and damage, but maybe just the first, I could just answer whether I'm positive about it or negative about the whole issue. So I think I'm also quite in the middle. I think I'm probably a bit more negative than Philipp, but I think that's always the case. And I will just maybe get back to it later. So the loss and damage, I don't know how much I should talk about the history of it, because probably you know some aspects, but just maybe quickly to recap. So the loss and damage is a type of fund as finance mechanism. It was the first time to appear at the COP. So that's a huge achievement in itself, that there was not complete rejection of the idea of a finance mechanism for loss and damage, because up until now it was quite rejected overall. And so basically the loss and damage focuses on aspects for the most vulnerable countries. So if you could, as Philipp said, if you could show that there was a huge significant damage done as, for example, a result of a flood or an extreme weather event or another type of shock, then you would get some sort of funding from this loss and damage fund. So it's important to keep in mind that this is only for losses and damages in these circumstances. So it's not for adaptation, it's not for any other purpose for developing countries to finance projects from, it's only for this. So then you can prove that, for example, you've lost 50 million euros, I don't know, about because of this flood or because people had to migrate, or you lost economic assets because of it, then you could have that funding. And that in itself is a huge achievement. So this marks basically the end of a 30-year-long debate, which basically materialized in recent years when the Warsaw International Mechanism and the Santiago Network was established, both of which are responsible for the loss and damage functioning, but they were not managed in terms of finance. And there was a huge debate between developed and developing countries. Developed countries claiming that there is no liability and no responsibility for the finance from their side, and therefore the financing is out of the question, and that's this mechanism should only be governed under the Paris Agreement, which rules out any possibility of finance in the future as well. And of course, developing countries rejected this notion throughout the years, and they argued that the loss and damage was governed both by the Conference of Parties, so the convention itself, and both by the Paris Agreement, which enabled them to claim financing. And now the issue was resolved, and it is truly a huge achievement. But at the same time, I'm always here to raise some disadvantages as well. So I think at the same time, we really need to keep in mind that by accepting this fund, we are basically limiting future possibilities of a huge international financial reform that would be necessary, which a lot of people claimed at COP that it would be necessary, and even before COP. And this means that, for example, we need to change the way that we finance investment projects in Africa in terms of renewable energy. And we need to change the way in which African countries are indebted. And this was very apparent at the conference as well. So in the discussions as well, it was delegates basically calling each other out and saying, for example, I think one from Ghana, one delegate from Ghana said that, what have you done about the negative impacts that we have? And you have done nothing, you have just worsened the situation and you have to take responsibility for it. You know, so we have to see that all of these tensions are very much present at the conference, and delegates really voice their concerns over this. And you know, maybe it doesn't get into the full text because the text is 8 pages. It's very technical, very legal language. But you know, maybe it's important to keep in mind that the COPs are platforms on which countries or delegates can actually voice these concerns and come to some sort of agreement or resolution with each other, because essentially these are human beings, you know. But another perhaps point of concern for me, which I'm not sure it was in the official media actually, or I'm not sure to what extent, but at the conference it was quite apparent, at least delegates made it sound like developing countries had to actually choose between equitable mitigation actions, so equitable achievement of the 1.5 goal, or they accept the funding. And this should not be part of the question. Both should be available to these countries, and they should not be limited to either have financing for losses and damages or have equitable 1.5 degree targets. So all these dynamics that are underlying these discussions, I think it's quite dangerous. And while it's actually a real achievement, it's symbolically and also materially a huge achievement for these countries. But we need to keep in mind that this marks a 30-year-long debate, and there was a reason for that long debate. And these tensions still persist, and we still need to do something about this. And the delegates are very aware of that. And so maybe that's about loss and damage. I could talk for a very long time about it still, but I think I have to move on. And so about the impact of the response measures, that was under the Paris Agreement and under the Convention as well. It was, I think in both of them, it was 12.12. And so what I saw was also this kind of tension, maybe in a more economic scenario. So countries, basically developing countries, emphasize the stranded assets that they have because of the economic stranded assets, because of the transition that they are undergoing, and of course the phasing out of the fossil fuels. But to be honest, it is also very clearly reflected, and it was reflected that in my personal experience at the negotiations as well, that although in a very formal and very diplomatic language, that sometimes that we still blame these developing countries for wanting to use fossil fuels, but we do not keep really in mind that a lot of investment in these countries is financed actually by European, American, and traditionally global North countries, you know. So I think the countries themselves are very aware of this, and they do in some sort of way take the blame for wanting to pursue fossil fuels, but they at the same time are very conscious that it's in a huge part, it's Western countries sponsoring fossil fuel damage still. And I think that is why they still persist on the loss and damage debate and on other debates as well, because essentially they need to show that that they know that who's responsible for these issues. It continues to be the West and the global North, and to a very little part the global South. And what else? And maybe if I just have a couple more minutes, it was very interesting to see what was not present at the conference. And while there was a lot of talk about the energy transition, renewable energy sources, which I think is amazing. And I think it's a huge achievement to actually have this on the agenda already, because as we have seen in a lot of reports and a lot of opinion pieces, the energy transition and the renewable energy sources uses in Africa, for example, are completely untapped. And if we actually changed the sources to renewable energy in the continent, that would contribute a lot to solving many issues, especially in the face of the war that is ongoing right now. But it was very concerning that there was not so much talk, and there is generally not so much talk about the negative impacts of the phasing out of fossil fuel, namely the green transition, so that we need a lot of green minerals for the electrification process and to actually transition to these sources of energy. And that this requires a projected increase of 500% in green minerals, basically, which are almost exclusively sourced from developing countries and countries of the global South. So, for example, in Africa, from DRC and Zambia. And this is an especially worrying trend that we are not talking about this. We are not figuring out solutions for this, because this is going to be the next huge danger of the transition that we need to face. And it would be better to face these problems before they start materializing rather than after. And because obviously green mineral mining, if it's expected to increase by 500% based on the demand for the current projected demand for it, that will mean a lot of social, environmental, and also economic impacts that we need to deal with. So basically what I mean with this, and in the whole COP in general, I think we have had a lot of symbolic high-level achievements, which I very much welcome and were welcomed by most of the people, I think. But I think we also need to keep in mind that in terms of narratives and discourses and ideas, we still think of the global South as the powerhouse of the whole world, basically, especially of the global North. And we are not moving away from a type of lifestyle that in discourse that means that we are still promising, and COP delegates seem to believe that we can maintain the level of life that we have right now and not change in consumerism, in demand, and in any other way, that this could be supplied by an energy transition without social and environmental consequences that could be even worse. So yeah, so I'm kind of positive about the achievements that we've had. And I'm positive that we have certain topics on the table which are extremely important. But to be honest, I think I remain very negative about the fact that this was supposed to be the COP of the implementation or operationalization, and besides the loss and damage function. And that has not happened at all. And countries are at loss, basically, how to manage their NDCs and how to put their NDCs into their own national agenda and also into the framework of other international institutions and their requirements. So I think there should be more talk about this, especially on the implementation COP. But I think these are my closing words.
Yeah, thank you, Eszter. And then I have a Xiaoran. Yeah. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's way more people than I expected, and thank you for coming here. And I'm really happy to sort of debriefing this COP27 with my colleagues right after the end of the COP27, the past 2 weeks. And today I will mainly talk about my general observation and also part of my research focus on my perspective on the key outcomes that we have for this COP27. I think in general, it's a very, very long COP, I would say. And indeed, like statistically, it's the second longest to date for the COP. And I can still remember those negotiations like extended to midnight, and also the closing plenary are actually happen in 3 a.m. in Egypt on Sunday. So which is very, yeah, unbelievable. And I can definitely see everyone wanted to end at some point, but it's just like this main conflicts haven't been solved, so they couldn't close it on time. And my personal 2 keywords for this COP is ambition and equity. And I think they're both important for the puzzles of this COP27 to make it a success. For ambition, which is definitely the enhancement for the 1.5 degree goal, which means not only phase out for coal, but also for all sorts of fossil fuel. And the other for equity is mainly reflected by the establishment for this loss and damage fund. My colleague already mentioned a lot about the loss and damage fund. I will also touch upon this a bit later. But I think in general, I think a lot of people cautiously call it a failure in terms of the mitigation goal. I will cautiously against it a bit, but still we should see maybe I think part of the reason is that they failed to include it very specifically with enhancement of language in the cover decision. And also probably because of the location of the presidency is in Egypt. So the presidency tried to block a bit for those languages enhancements in the cover text, if despite the reiteration for different parties to echo for that. And also, if you look forward, the next COP28 will be hosted in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. So that would be also a kind of, I will also be a bit pessimistic about the location, which means that that's also an oil country. It's very difficult to really negotiate under that sort of circumstances. But in general, my general feeling about this, I think it's a very good mixed feeling of this overall success or failure. I think it's sends some positive signal for sure. When we look at loss and damage funds, like my colleague already mentioned, it's a decades of struggling for those people suffer the most in the front line of the climate crisis. For those whose home are being wiped out by the floods, adaptation is not a solution already. They need money to rebuild their home and their livelihoods. And you can see on the screen, I have this table for the position for different country on the issue of establish this fund at COP27. You can see a very clear, actually, the differentiation of the traditional North-South paradigm. So if you talk about power dynamics, if the power dynamics change or not on the UNFCCC, I would say probably still the same. The global South works so hard trying to get this sort of climate justice and equity from the global North. So I think this is a very positive signal, because if you can imagine, like climate, this loss and damage fund is still a taboo when back in Glasgow. So now, like, it be actually put in the agenda, and it also get the fund established. To everyone's surprise, I think that's the beauty of the UNFCCC negotiation, because it always seems impossible until it's done. So I think I can record still in the last Friday, so which means it's the last day of this COP27. People are still don't know whether or not there will be a fund or not. So this is here it is, it's the fund. But I will also cautiously worry about this is because like all the other climate finance, if there's no money in the box, it's just an empty box. So back to 2009 Copenhagen, we have this 100 billion climate finance commitment from the developed country, but they still haven't realized that yet. And we have in Glasgow with the double adaptation funds. Yeah, here it is, no money on the table. So if we follow the same status quo of what we have in the past, the loss and damage fund would just be an empty box. So we have to break the sort of like past in the history. So we should be more careful. And I can expect a very long negotiation, complicated negotiation in the future to have this, to make this fund operationalized. So that's a very, I would expect a very difficult negotiation. And personally, I follow the Article 6 negotiation as my research focus. I follow it closely in the past 2 weeks, and I would say it's a very boring negotiation, if you would say, very technical, very into detail, and like I got the same feeling like Eszter. Like if you leave the laptop for a while, when you come back, they're still discussing the same thing. Like it's either they bracket or bracket or unbracket. So it's very, very technical thing. But I will try to summarize it in a more general language. So Article 6 is mainly discussed about this cooperative approaches that you can, countries can treat emissions through this carbon trade market. And the main conflicts we can see at this on this specific issue is what's the relation between those 6.2 and 6.4. So I will try to make it simple. So when you sail in this carbon emission program or outcomes, you need to be sort of like have some certain certain degree of transparency and integrity within this database or registry. So I think the main conflict is whether or not we make it more transparent, or whether or not we have this units can be transferred throughout the whole Article 6. And I couldn't summarize with you with a very like black-white differentiation of what developing country want or what developed country want. I think on the ground, it's very, very complicated picture or mixed picture you can expect. They take different position on very different things. So, and also how many efforts developed country willing to put into those capacity building program to help those developing country to have this capacity to really get into this registration system, how to submit those forms, how to follow the same category of those transparency process. So of course, developing countries want more, but developed countries say, okay, wait a minute. We don't want to spend more money on this workshop or that workshop. Maybe you should just follow the Paris Agreement capacity building in general. So that's some sort of like very conflicts you can observe from those negotiations, and also how to keep a good balance of different issues. Obviously, the 6.2 and 6.4 receive way more attention than the 6.8, which is on the non-market approaches. But if you think about those bottom-up approaches, actually they have enormous potential of actually bring more actors on the board. So I would not want to bore you with too much details, but more about my personal observation, which I have throughout this negotiation. So you can see actually those are the screenshots I had when I follow those negotiation. Which is actually, as an observer, I do have the access to all those informal consultation, but begin with every negotiation, they will also announce that this meeting is open to observer. If any parties reject or object with this idea, we will shut the door like sort of immediately. Of course, they are stating in a more polite way, but that's the whole meaning of that. So, but none of those negotiations, I follow over 30 negotiations about this Article 6, they are all open to observer. And also you can see here, like they actually invite endogenous group in the room to discuss some very, very technical detail about this Article 6, which I find it it's very meaningful. And also you can see one of the delegates even wear hat in the room, which means actually the AC is really high. So it's a very ironic picture, you know, like it's the air condition is super high, like they even need to like wear scarf and hats in the room to prevent them with the cold. And also the AC actually cause a lot of trouble when they are trying to talk. There's a lot of noise background there. And you can also, they are all often be stopped by noise from the airline. So it's a very ironic picture when they are doing this negotiation. But I think in general, Article 6, it's the last part, actually the last puzzle from the Paris Agreement, and it also be concluded, actually the rulebook is be concluded in Glasgow, but there's still a lot of technical detail to be complete in the future, not just for this COP, but also in the future. You can see that's the feature of this system. It's a very slow, but when it moves, I think it's just, they will do make progress, but you will never expect any rapid progress from that. And just some general reflection on the accessibility and inclusiveness. I also don't go there in person for a lot of reasons. And one is the time conflicts, and others, I also do not want to add up too much emission to the world, sort of. So, but I would say I was quite surprised that the online accessibility is actually quite good. And I could imagine if I really go there, being like in person, I couldn't follow that much negotiation myself, because some negotiation actually happen in the midnight. So if I imagine if I was there, I couldn't like stay there for that long time. So for this, I have, for the online participation, I actually participate all the section I want, only with few, I think 2 out of 30 with the technical issue that I couldn't actually join it in the very beginning of this meeting, but they solved it, I think, in a later phase. So I don't have any problem with the accessibility. And also, one funny thing is that I actually be in Glasgow last year. And the main problem for me to go there is the UK visa. I spent a lot of money on that. I still couldn't get it in time. But with the Egyptian presidency, they actually pay for your visa for going there. So I think that's, if you, in terms of accessibility, that's actually a good progress. And also that's the first time that activists can actually be in the blue zone. So that's where the negotiation happened. That's not happen in the history, because they always in the green zone, which is the outside of the negotiation circle. Like they always criticize that there seems like a invisible wall between the negotiation and the activists, like in the past COPs. But here they're actually can standing there and have their voice be heard. So I think that's actually good. It's a quite surprise to me if you think about the location of this this COP. So I think it's an African COP, and it's get a very good milestone done. So I think I'm in general positive about it, but how to operationalize the fund, and I think that's the main problem of all the finance that we have in climate. It's without money, it's just empty words. So thank you. That's it.
Yeah, I think So Xiaoran, you can also
stay
stay.
here and you can maybe answer
No,
some
it's question
questions.
time.
Oh, I forgot how many people are here.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yes, so first of all, thank you, all three of you, for your summaries and conclusions that you drew from this COP. And now we are going to open for questions. We don't have too much time, so I think we do a couple of questions and then there'll be time afterwards also if you stay around. So please, yeah, here in the front, the IBM crew. Yeah, so Andrew, please.
Very first little one. And you've got observer status for this.
Yeah, I'm an observer.
How come? What's the how did you manage that?
Actually, we have, I think that's a systematic issue. So we actually do have I join as the representative of the food. So I think different universities have their quota for each COP, and we have contact person within the VU who can sign up for the participants as observer.
And the observer status, even though you were online, you got more access than you would do if you're a regular person just going to the website.
If you're a regular person, you don't have access to the website.
Yeah.
The platform, I mean, yeah.
Maybe one thing you can maybe when you ask a question, maybe just what do you say? Repeat it, right? That's the word.
Oh.
So then we have it on the video.
Oh,
So.
yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. That's fine. Okay, next.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Eszter or Xiaoran, if you were also at the observing the negotiations for the loss and damage fund, but I'm wondering what the framing of the European delegates was who were in favor of the fund. Was it for like altruistic purposes, or was it framed more as a climate migration prevention scheme?
I didn't quite catch the last part. Could you repeat?
Yeah, so maybe I just rephrase also for the sake of the recording which we make. So the question was what the European delegates, how they framed the debate about loss and damage. Was that more an altruistic framing, or did they revert to that as sort of a migration and domestic issue?
I think it's quite hard to answer because the EU had to combine positions. So basically, it stemmed from a joint position of the historic position, in which they hugely opposed, like the US. So they were very much starting off as an opposition to the loss and damage fund. But at the end, you know, it was basically mostly them who came forward and actually succeeded to bring the loss and damage to a conclusion. So I think this has to do basically with what Philipp said, but this is just a theory. It's not really confirmed because, you know, you wouldn't say that during a meeting or as a delegate, you know, you wouldn't say that, well, as a responsibility for the Ukrainian war and how we outsource fossil fuels from other countries of the world, we will support the loss and damage fund. So I wouldn't really say that whether it was altruistic or whether it was more of a benevolent aspect to it, but there was definitely a change of perspective, I would say. It was very clear.
Just a very short addition. I think it's a really good question. And although it's hard to back this up, but I think there's certain reasoning behind that it is a trade-off, right? So you say, well, we don't really achieve a lot on the mitigation front because we have this huge energy transition problem right now. We have to focus on short-term measures. You know, we have some old nuclear plants and whatever, and all these debates, but you can't really stall the negotiations. So some people have argued that this has happened because there was a feeling that there had to be a bit of give and take.
Exactly.
I mean, it's hard to, but I think that's sort of the dynamic that happened.
Yeah, exactly. It was definitely clearly a trade-off. So, I mean, this just from my experience of what the delegates said at the end, and also from press conferences that I listened to. So many people said that it's a trade-off for the mitigation target, and that after this it will be really hard to make a 1.5 target equitable for developing countries because they accepted this fund and now I mean, I'm so sorry to say this, but you can shut up a bit. You know, you got what you wanted. You can just accept that the rest of the negotiations will go another way. But that's maybe a bit too negative.
No, there were more questions. Maybe there are also more in the back. Come here. It's good.
Yeah, just curious if there's any discussion in any circles on mechanisms for potentially limiting regulatory capture or maybe limiting lobbying power in these decision-making arenas.
Maybe I start on that because I have not listened to all the negotiations as my colleagues did. But what I did is I had a lot of, let's say, input from people who've been there even in person, who I followed on Twitter, some colleagues, also the general, which was low press coverage, right? And I think in those debates, that actually is a really important discussion. Maybe in the global north, there might be a different discussion in the global south. But I think there's a realization that the fossil fuel lobby, you might call it, is a really important elephant in the room, and literally in the room, that needs to be tackled because no one really addressed it, and it's getting a bit more because now it's sort of in the text. So it talks about renewable energy and low emission energy. It doesn't talk about, but it's sort of getting ever closer. And as I mentioned, I think they are there because they sense it's now really getting serious. But there's really interesting questions around what the impact is and whether there should be something done. And the same debate about the sponsorship. You probably know that Coca-Cola was one of the sponsors of Egypt in the COP, and what that signifies. And I think you have to realize that 196 countries have very different opinions. Some think it's great, it's good soft drink, right? I mean, and others are like, oh, it's the end of the world. It's really hypocritical because, yeah. Anyway. So I think this debate is deep enshrined in there, but it's not solved, and I think it will take more COPs to do that, to solve that. Yeah. Let's start over here. Yeah. Yes, yeah. Please.
Yeah, I want to ask her for something. I think that the big problem was probably the diversity of SDG South, because the management there in the United Nations as well. Because they are really like old people there, you know, they are not active, but you guys, you are young, you have a different kind of energy that the old, they don't have it. Otherwise, I don't think that, you know, the Egypt must be in good way instructed if there was more young people active. And yeah. Is it? Yeah. So my I criticize the management.
Yeah. No, I think
think about it as well.
It's a very good question. So how was the conference well organized? And I think we can't really judge that from afar. But maybe we can say something of those that observed about the accessibility and the voice of youth, because you mentioned that I think in passing that there was a change in accessibility. So what was your feeling towards that?
I think in general, I think the accessibility itself is actually quite surprising. I think it's good, and I'm not sure how much effort. What's the balance between what's the balance behind this web platform, whether it's UNFCCC or it's the Egyptian presidency? But I can definitely tell you, the technical person behind the computer is from the Egypt country, so we're actually discussed like the technical issue on the platform. I say, okay, I couldn't hear the sound, can you fix it for me? So I think like in general, accessibility itself is acceptable. And also if you consider that's actually the post-COVID paradigm that we have only for like, we have that in Glasgow and we have that in Egypt, that's only 2 years. So they still need a lot to learn. That's a learning process for sure. And also in terms of the age, I would say negotiation itself as a very high sort of like I don't want to put it standard, but it's really take years of experience to really try to comprehend or understand what they're actually talking about, and what's like, for one thing is actually understand what they're talking about, and the other thing is what's the meaning behind their language. So what's the difference behind different language of shall or should or encourage or request? What's the behind meaning of that? So it's very tricky. So you want experienced delegation, but you also want energy from the young people. So I think in terms of youth, I think this COP set a very good example of letting the activists into the blue zone. So they have the chance to actually face-to-face to all the delegation parties and the older people. So they have their voice being heard, I think, better than before we have Glasgow. All the activists are actually be shelled out of the sort of like those barriers, the barriers we have. So they have a huge distance. So.
See a couple more hands, and I think we need to compress them. So we will collect the questions. I will then repeat them as good as I can, and then we will have one round of answers. So I saw a hand over there. you and theirs, exactly. Okay, great. So let's do this round. Please.
Just a quick one. Where did you get the information about the protesters being in the blue zone? Because I actually got the exact opposite impression of following German activists being at the COP and actually stating that there are really tight restrictions and controls, and yeah, that they are being observed by Egyptian, I don't know, whatever, agents or something. And yeah, so I got the complete different picture of the protests and organized protests.
Yeah. So do we?
Yeah, maybe on this one you can directly respond, because this is actually good. So the question was, maybe you can elaborate on your observation that there was good user representation and accessibility, because you heard other reports from youth or NGO representatives of Germany and others that had problems or felt observed. And yeah.
Yeah, actually, I think from my side of source of information, I follow also the tweeters of those observers, and also the carbon brief coverage on the daily of this negotiation. So they actually said that they do let them in the blue zone, and they also have a picture of that. So probably some certain type of activists are being probably blocked. I don't know. So because I'm not personally in there. So
yeah, maybe just it's a really good question, and also from what I heard, there is a difference between that you can go in and that you have the feeling someone's watching you. That makes a really big difference, and there's maybe something to discuss there. Something that was voiced by many in the run-up to this conference was exactly that was a history, and a recent history of political activism in Egypt that was silenced, actually people being still in jail. And then there were others that could be there. And the question was, why can those Egyptian youth be there and others not? And you can think about that yourself, but there was that debate. And so I would say it's at least, yeah, it's not one picture, a rosy picture, but it's sort of contested still, but maybe something to look further into. So there were two more hands. Let's go there and then end up over there, please.
I was wondering if in this COP, if there were further conversations on agriculture, because I was reading that this year there was going to be more talks on it and maybe practices that need to be implemented or supported. Did you feel, compared to previous COPs, that it gained more relevance or any progress was made, or was it something that was sort of ignored or put on the side?
Yeah. Eszter, do you have a short answer to that, or?
Yeah, I thought we collect.
Yeah, so okay. Then sorry. Yeah, let's collect, and then you had a hand up, please.
International negotiations are not a place for activists, it's more domestic negotiations. And I was wondering if you have suggestions for activists and legal students in this room.
Okay.
Could they join those?
Of course. Great question. Yeah. So two questions. Let's do that here then. Okay. So the activism I can maybe say a little bit about, and the agriculture. I'll just look it up if you're interested, because there is a paragraph on agriculture. It's the shortest paragraph in the entire thing. It's only one line basically, or it's one heading. So I do think from that, and also what I heard, agriculture isn't reflected in the document. Doesn't mean there weren't a lot of negotiations on that, but I would like to hear from the colleagues. But you looked at slightly different things, so it might have been unnoticed by us because we had a certain bias on what we study. Eszter, you want to? Can you say something about
there wasn't really much on agriculture. So to be honest, because I just sometimes, when you scroll through the list of meetings that are happening, and then there was agriculture, and I was like, what? Like, this is new. And so basically I didn't see many items, but I did not follow it, you know what I mean? So I don't have a first-hand experience. It's just that when I scrolled through my meeting list, and for example, when you look at the daily EMB reports, you don't see so much about agriculture. But you're right that it should have been more addressed, but that wasn't really the focus of this year's COP.
Yeah.
Personally, I also didn't closely follow this issue area, but I would definitely see actually more appearance of the agriculture if you compare with the COP26 in Glasgow. And I would say it do receive increasing attention, but probably not the level of the attention people expected from the COP. But I can see more like text-wise, they're there. So yeah.
I can show you or can tell you.
But you can also, if I can add, you can also download from the. Sorry.
Good. Let me maybe then close with trying to answer your question, and not that I can answer it, but maybe a very concrete thing. So what can we do? And there's a lot of stuff. I mean, you could glue yourself to things. You can throw tomato soup, and these. I'm not going to advocate for that per se, but there's a lot of stuff to do. But one thing to start right here in the university is maybe the most logical, because we're all here. So we had a debate with our bosses, the CVB, about which bank we use as the food. So we have a bank and we use that to pay bills, but also we lend money from that bank. So some people say, shouldn't that be a bank that has their portfolio exclusively in climate positive investments? And I would say, yeah, that should be the case. Now, and I'm not going to bore you with that too much, but then the financial people come and say, well, that's a good reason why we can change the bank. Because if we were to change, all of our mortgages would default and we had to renew them and we would get much worse, which means you students would get less value because we would be poorer. So now I ask you, in terms of activism, we could go and lobby and do all sorts of things and try to make the university change. And that's just one example. But what I want to try to say is there always is trade-offs, right? So we, first of all, need to have a debate about that, because maybe not everyone is actually happy with that decision. I personally would support that, actually. I told that also the CVB. But it's just one example why it's sometimes really difficult for decision makers to take decisions. But if they feel that all the students have a very clear picture, then they might actually reconsider. Because I'm just one person. We go there and say, oh, you should maybe have a different bank. If all the students come in action and they say, look, this is not good, because actually other universities can change their bank. So the UvA can. That probably works as an argument. So I think that's a concrete example. So you need to lobby around concrete things that have relevance for people where they are, so that they get passionate about them, instead of talking about very abstract things that are so remote that it will not really get anyone, get their asses up, so to speak. That will be my concrete suggestion. That was just one example. I could name 15 other things that we could do here to start with at this university. Good.
Well, I think that's a good closing of the circle, because we are at the Green Office. So if you want to get active, you're in the right place already. I think Karina left, but you can also ask me. So yeah, we are always open for anyone who wants to get active and change things. So just let us know, or just come by the Green Office any other day, and let your ideas be heard. So, well, I think that is for now. You're more than welcome to stay around. Thank you all for coming. It's been a great pleasure to have you. Thank you, Eszter, for zooming in from Paris, and you too for preparing, and after these two quite intense weeks, I guess. So yes, thank you very much, and big round of applause.